everyone. I'd like to officially welcome you to today's webinar, Addressing Mental Health Challenges. I'm Jessica Birch, a training coordinator with the Corporation for National and Community Service with the Office of AmeriCorps Vista, and I will be your host for today's webinar. I'll also be facilitating the live Q&A at the end of the session. Also joining us are Amy Kanata and Jenny Farrell from our partners at Education Northwest, who have helped to prepare today's webinar and will be managing the WebEx technology. You'll see them in the chat and Q&A to help address questions you may have during the session. So, our main speakers today. I already introduced myself, so now I'm going to introduce Elaine Williams. Elaine has been a VISTA trainer and facilitator for 20 years. She has served on curriculum committees for creating and refining pre-service orientation and VISTA leader curriculum since 2001. Elaine has a master's degree in social work and specializes in building communication skills and holistic approaches to working with individuals, teams, and organizations. So, what are we talking about today in our webinar? Addressing mental health challenges. So we hope that by the end of this webinar that you'll be able to have a working definition of what mental health is, along with the prevalence of mental health disorders in the U.S. population. We also hope that you'll be able to utilize positive inquiry, which we'll talk about during the session, as a method of communicating with your VISTAs, while recognizing any challenges that they may have that may require increased supervisory support. We also hope that you'll be able to recognize the steps that you can take as a VISTA supervisor to implement preventable and proactive supportive responses to ensure a VISTA's successful management of any challenges that may arise during their service and that may interfere with their roles and responsibilities. We also want to hope that you can identify the steps that you need to take if you realize that supervisory support is not enough to manage the VISTA's challenges. I do want to point out that we have offered a webinar focusing on responding to VISTA member work-related challenges earlier this summer. So if you're looking for more practical tips and advice for communicating with your member, maybe specifically around performance and those sorts of things, we encourage you to access that on-demand webinar on the VISTA campus. And Amy has just posted the link to that. It's called Retention 201, Responding to VISTA Member Challenges. It's a great webinar, so go ahead and check that out. So we want to start out with an activity here. So there is a feature in WebEx, it's pointed out on the screen here, the raise your hand feature. So the question we want to ask is, raise your hand if you know someone who has been affected by a mental health disorder. So just go ahead and do that. I'm going to go and scroll through the little hands here and see how many we have. So I'm seeing like everybody has risen their hand. I guess risen is the right word. So everyone has. Okay. So that is indicative of what we've learned and what we've heard and what we're going to talk about here. You know, this is something that's very prevalent, and it's something we really we found that needs to be addressed. So I'm going to turn it over to Elaine, who's going to kick us off. So Elaine, take it away.
Thanks, Jessica. I just want you all to know what a pleasure it is for me to be able to be on this webinar with all of you. And I just am not totally surprised and yet surprised that so many hands went up. And that seems to be the issue of the day, really, how to help our VISTAs manage and people in general manage their mental health challenges. I regard your role as a supervisor as highly important, and any success the VISTAs have has a lot to do with your direct involvement with them. Before I really get into this, though, I really want to share with you that our discussion about mental health emphasizes that we are approaching this webinar to create heightened awareness of mental health issues and not so much to identify or diagnose mental illness, and we discourage you actually from doing that. Mental health is not just about mental stability, but it includes emotional and social well-being. All three of these human dimensions influence each other They must be viewed together to understand the degree of mental health well-being an individual has given at any moment in time. And this can fluctuate just depending on how life is either being kind to us or challenging us. How our thoughts and emotions affect each other will determine our actions and behaviors. So it's important to not just look at behaviors and actions, but to realize that behind that are our thoughts and emotions and the ability or the inability to manage them. So any approach to understanding mental health needs to look at contributing factors that we've identified on the slide. So let's take a look at what mental health is and the prevalence of mental health disorders in the U.S. population. Keep in mind, all program areas are affected by mental health disorders and problems. Some individuals have accepted their mental challenges and have sought help and may even be on medication. Others, however, may be unaware or may have rejected the notion they have mental health problems. This latter group may be difficult to supervise because they are not in treatment. So let's take a look at some of the relevant statistics. 1 in 5 American adults experience a mental health disorder each year. That's a really high statistic, and it means that we encounter people every day who may or may not know they have mental health disorders. Half of all mental health disorders begin by the age of 14, and 75% by age 24. Many of our VISTAs are in their early 20s, so this statistic is particularly important to be aware of. Chances are that you're working with someone who is facing mental health problems on a daily basis. These problems, as you well may know since you've raised your hands, don't discriminate and can affect anyone regardless of age, gender, economic status, race, sexuality, etc. And what I've noticed in the populations that I've worked with at pre-service orientation is depression, social anxiety, some bipolar conditions, people with PTSD, and even some who are battling addictions. So these are the more common ones, but certainly not exclusive to the VISTAs. You know, VISTAs and supervisors, organizational employees, community members may be challenged by mental health issues. So it's not only important to help your VISTA manage their own challenges, but you may also have to coach them on how to manage clients, colleagues, and partners they work with and serve in the community who may also be struggling. As the supervisor, it's important that you are modeling ways for them to cope and manage others so that they can encounter the ability to work with them in a way that is productive for the organization, for the project, for the community, and for themselves too. New VISTAs may be juggling a variety of life events, and it's really not, they really are juggling a lot of life events while navigating the required paperwork and outboarding tasks. We've named a few here, but one that isn't here that I thought of while we were waiting to get on today was a lot of VISTAs who are grieving. And these are usually the national VISTAs who have left home and left family and friends behind and feel a loss. And so not that that's a mental health issue, but it is something that we need to be sensitive to. Also, many VISTA supervisors are new to their roles of coaching and guiding VISTAs, and I noticed a lot of new supervisors when I checked the registration list. Many of you answered our chat prompt about how you were feeling as you began your new transition. Jessica, can you tell us some of the themes you saw in the chat around how people felt starting their new job?
Yeah, Elaine, thank you so much. So there's a lot of different things. So someone said, when I start a new work environment, I'm usually pretty excited and nervous. I like to learn new things, but the first day can be overwhelming with new information about the environment. That is so true. No matter what you start, anything can be a little bit overwhelming at first. Someone here said, I started my new job as director exactly 1 month ago, so the feelings are still very fresh. I was nervous that I wouldn't be able to handle everything, and I remind myself to breathe and that I cannot learn everything in a week, which is very sometimes hard to cope with. You want to learn everything so quickly, you want to feel useful, you want to just get in there and start going, and it's hard when you have to actually, you know, figure out and learn what you have to do. Someone else here said, I remember feeling overwhelmed by how much there was to do and how little I knew about how to do it. In retrospect, I should have received better training or orientation, and that would have helped. So it's a great thing there. You know, getting that training, making sure your VISTAs are prepared for what they're about to take on. And also definitely a combination of nervous and excited, kind of like the first day of school feeling. I'm always weirdly nervous that my new colleagues won't like me. I'm sure they like you. It's a nervous thing, though. Everyone kind of has that. You know, I want people to like me. I want to be seen as doing a good job. I want to be, you know, useful and wanted at this organization. And someone here also said, I'm usually super nervous, anxious, and introverted for the first 3 months or so of a new job. So, you know, we hear those same things, nervous, anxious, overwhelmed. But I think this is very interesting, too, because someone here said that they feel very introverted, so that it takes them a while to get out of their shell, which, Elaine, I think you could probably agree that, you know, sometimes that can be interpreted a different way. Someone maybe is more introverted, and that comes across a certain way. So that's very hard. Those are great. One thing before I transition back over to Elaine, Elaine, I think there was some static on your line, so people were having some trouble hearing you. So I don't know if there's a way to adjust your mic or your phone, but just wanted to give you a heads up, and I will turn it back on over to you.
Okay. I hope this is better. You know, your answers were so poignant in that every one of us has had a new beginning. And actually has had many new beginnings. And one of the ways to be a really great supervisor, you know, welcoming your VISTA to their project site and to their full year as VISTAs is to remember what it took for you to adjust and to have that understanding that it's going to take a lot of coping abilities for them to adjust. And some are going to cope better than others. So if we can go to the next slide. So let's accept that most VISTAs will be somewhat nervous. I think we can accept that, beginning their assignment. And even though they're anxious and nervous, their ability to adapt, ask questions, engage with others, along with a good dose of self-confidence will see them through their new beginning. All VISTAs feel nervous and anxious about their project placement. And we've discovered this at the pre-service orientation, which we also call the PSO. On opening night, frequently I ask them to share with another VISTA what they're nervous about for their upcoming year. And the volume in the room goes up to immeasurable decibels. When I debrief them afterwards, just acknowledging and normalizing their nervousness, you can feel the sense of relief in the room. It's actually palpable. So sometimes just a simple comment like it would be understandable if you feel nervous or anxious right now. For most VISTAs, a detailed VAD coupled with a strong welcoming on-site orientation training, clearly defined expectations, and an obvious path for support will provide the platform for a successful beginning and a strong supervisor-VISTA relationship. However, other VISTAs may not have the mental and emotional coping abilities to manage their anxieties, and so we're going to focus on these now. The VISTAs with less coping abilities may struggle in a variety of mental, social, and emotional ways that we may or may not be aware of. And as Jessica just talked about, as an introvert, you know, we have to remember introverts process everything internally, so they may not verbalize what's going on inside of them, unlike the extrovert who really needs people to process and will be frustrated if none are available. So given that background and context, for sure, it will require a quick assessment of vulnerabilities that they may be expressing on the part of the supervisor and increased support and understanding of what they might be going through, what is being said and not said. Very sensitive communication and tone of voice means everything when you're working with someone with mental health challenges. Clear boundaries and expectations, and a longer on-site orientation training. A VISTA I knew not too long ago, came across with a really defensive attitude at the pre-service orientation, and I could tell her defensiveness was a cover for a lack of confidence, high social anxiety, and some depression. Despite exhibiting an I-can-handle-anything attitude, she was in fact scared to make a mistake, and her procrastination belied a perfectionist streak. Lots of times people procrastinate because they don't think they can do something perfectly. She felt self-conscious to ask questions, and really underlying all this, there was a fear of looking stupid. She was fortunate to have a supervisor that was not threatened by her attitude and realized it was her way of hiding her insecurities. The supervisor offered her a lot of clarity around expectations, and she told me that she had already been on site by the time she came to the pre-service orientation, that she received a 3-week on-site orientation training with a lot of opportunity to experience her program by doing some limited direct service for a short time. The supervisor made it clear that she did not expect her to know everything, but instead she verbalized she wanted the VIS to ask questions. You know, whether you're introvert, extrovert, whether you have mental health challenges, whether you're just simply nervous, being able to ask questions is a way of saying, I'm invested in you. I want to support you, and, you know, anything that is a question for you, let's talk about it together. Let's dialogue. You know, when you can assure people to not be afraid to make mistakes, that reduces anxiety, and they don't have a need to hide mistakes or hold back because they're afraid of what's going to happen. So the supervisor needs to provide a lot of consistency, focused inquiry and feedback, and if you can do that related to their VAD, it will give them an increased sense of security because not only are you building a trusting relationship, but you're helping them clarify what their roles and responsibilities are going to be. In time, over the PSO, this VISTA told me she was on medication for depression and anxiety, and she shared that with her supervisor, who really appreciated knowing that. So if your VISTAs confide in you, you do need to have an understanding response. It doesn't mean we should make meaning out of what they said. It just factors into their ability to cope. And we have to be aware of the stigma attached to having a mental challenge, mental health challenge, or mental illness. And one of the approaches I want to talk about is positive inquiry. And it's a simple, very effective way to communicate, and we'll go more into it in a little bit. But I just want you to know that that is definitely a way that you can communicate very effectively with your VISTAs, whether they have mental health challenges or not. But let's take a closer look at common symptoms and patterns that we might see in members who are more vulnerable. All VISTAs experience transitions, specifically endings and beginnings, both of which, as we said, create anxiety. New beginnings bring the unknown and the unpredictable into play. This is temporary, and so most people will feel temporary tension, and this dissipates pretty quickly. So if you look on the column on the left, typical coping symptoms and patterns, there are some examples of what they may experience and what you yourself may have experienced when you began. However, for some individuals, new beginnings can trigger old fears and or an internal sense of chaos that may linger for a prolonged period of time. So if you look at the list on the right, prolonged symptoms and patterns, and note the difference between the two. Accompanying these complex internal issues may be behaviors that may be difficult to deal with over time. For example, I've met VISTA candidates at PSOs whose VADs have very little specific information. For some VISTAs, coaching them about questions they can ask their supervisor or suggesting that they go talk to the state rep was more than sufficient to allay their anxiety. But for others, these interventions were not sufficient. It's especially important for you, the supervisor, to observe and assess quickly any prolonged symptoms or maladaptive behaviors which might require additional and prolonged support. This next slide offer some warning signs and symptoms of stress. If short-lived, they may not create any major concerns. However, if they are prolonged, then they warrant your attention. Observe and identify the degree of stress your VISTA is experiencing and how they're managing it. And do this right from the beginning so you can tune into coping patterns that serve them or don't serve them. If your VISTA is struggling, determine what steps you will take to offer support, and do this, again, as early as you can. Keep in mind that behavioral symptoms are an external way an individual displays internal turmoil, whether it's cognitive, emotional, social, or even physical. If you are noting behavioral struggles, you may want to inquire about what they're experiencing internally instead of just focusing on their behaviors. And we're going to talk a little bit of what that sounds like and how we would language that just in a few minutes. So in this next slide, here are some key ingredients for building a strong foundation for your VISTA supervisor relationships. There's no substitute for consistent feedback and follow-up. I mean, if anything falls into the well, it's usually because there was an inconsistency in feedback or there was maybe very little or no follow-up. But both of those offer clarity to their role and assignments. It offers answers to questions. It makes certainty come through what they feel is uncertain, and it keeps them clear about their goals. Reviewing any of these once is not sufficient, and I stress that big time, because VISTAs are nervous and anxious initially. And if you think about it for yourself, when I'm anxious, I'm listening, but I'm not hearing everything. And so repetition is very important for all your VISTAs, not just the ones who have special challenges. Use the VAD as the cornerstone of your supervisory meeting, and within that discussion, give consistent feedback. And the thing I want to say about the VAD is it's a working tool. It's a dynamic description of what their responsibilities are. So your meetings with them can be highly efficient and very effective in helping them know what is expected in a very focused way by making that VAD the center of your meeting with them each and every time you meet. The third recommendation I have is to remember you are role modeling with and for your VISTA practices in communication and relationship building that they can utilize as they work with their clients. This is really true capacity building as you are helping them transfer relationships, building skills that will create strong relationships. And in that transfer, that is something we're asking them to do for capacity building with the organization, and that's something we're asking them to do when they engage in community empowerment. So right there in your own relationship with your VISTA is an opportunity for them to experience it. Acceptance of each individual, whatever that looks like for that person, and mutual respect, the VISTA to the supervisor and the supervisor for the VISTA is a core ingredient. And when that's present, you have pretty much, if you follow these ingredients and these suggestions, a strong start, which more times than not will guarantee a strong finish. I do want to talk about communication styles. Knowing your own and your VISTAs is vitally important. And the questions on this slide focus on establishing a clear understanding of each of your styles. A style is different from a communication skill because it's a natural pattern of communicating. You know, some people are more direct, some people are very excited when they communicate, some people are very quiet and have not too much to say. Some people are more indirect. So you need to figure out not only what your VISTA's communication style is, but your own. And these are both covered in the pre-service orientation workbooks and the supervisor's workbooks. So for some people to save face is important, and for others it's not. And you know, some people value task completion and others are more focused on building relationships. And none of these are right or wrong, good or bad. However, the degree that it complements your style or their style, or the degree that it does not, is going to dictate how many adjustments have to be made by both of you. So we'll go on to the next slide. You know, in the pre-service orientation training, we do something called an individual development plan with the VISTAs. And we do it on their first day, and we do it on the last day. And so really a lot of what happens at that pre-service orientation is threaded through the VISTA's individual development plan and communication styles, and can go directly, consciously into your on-site orientation training that you're providing them. So I would ask them to show you their individual development plan. I would ask you to show them to show you how they scored on the communication styles, and that's going to give you a sense of their strengths, their talents, and how they have helped you, how they've helped themselves cope in the past with new beginnings. And you can build on that because you can ensure that your work with them will incorporate the individual development plan. And in that plan, you're going to see personal goals and professional goals that they want to achieve during their VISTA year. And they've indicated some steps they'd like to take. So that's something that they should be working jointly with you on. And when you can do that, and when you inquire and ask them about it, again, that's another signal of your investment in them. This next slide emphasizes a really three important questions to ask yourself in any circumstance when you're supervising, coaching, mentoring VISTAs over time. However, it's especially vital when we start to work with them in terms of special challenges that they might have. It's really easy to make assumptions. It's really easy, we're prone as human beings to impressions, first impressions. And when I ask this question, do I have all the information I need to consider and meet this VISTA's unique needs to ensure their success, it will cause me to pause. It will cause me to stop and think about conclusions I'm making, assumptions I'm making, and do I actually have all the information I need to do that accurately? I just can't emphasize enough that reflecting on this question is not only going to give you answers to how you observe your VISTA and how you can refrain from being non-judgmental in terms of the behaviors or the insecurities they might have, but it's also going to inform you about what resources you do or don't need. And you want to be thinking about that because you are not there to fix their problems, you're there to respond to their problems. So I'm going to pause for a moment and ask you to look at, if you go to the next slide, what other key ingredients help build a strong foundation with VISTA members? We've talked about communication, we've talked about being open, we've talked about knowing their communication style, about being focused with them, about offering a lot of feedback and follow-up. What are some of your key ways that you ensure a strong foundation is being built for your VISTA members? I'll give you just a few moments. I'm going to ask you to enter your ideas in the chat box, and then Jessica will read some of them in a few minutes.
Thank you so much, Elaine. So, yeah, what other key ingredients help build a strong foundation? Let's see, Heba here says social network. So I feel like that can mean two different things, like the social interaction face-to-face with other coworkers, or are we talking about social networking, those sorts of things? Both can be great, but I have a feeling you meant the former, about more face-to-face contact at the site. Bridget here said constant communication, consistent instruction, and feedback. Consistency is such a key tool. No matter what it is, just be consistent. Like that's starting something new, anything, if you guys could provide consistency, it's always going to help in the end. Also, let's see. Regularly scheduled meetings with agendas. It's good. Give people an idea of what they should expect, what the culture of the organization is, how they do meetings, how they work with meetings, how they work with one another. Let's see here. Wanda here says establishing an open door policy. So ensuring that VISTAs know that they can approach you without fear. That's so true. They want to make sure that you're approachable, that they can ask those questions and get the advice and get the resources they need, you know, freely and not have to be worried about it. Let's see, Tam here said comprehensive OSAT, weekly or regular weekly supervision sessions, open door policy again. Also, Sarah here said getting to know your VISTA as a person. That's good. Your VISTA is a VISTA, but they are a person first. So definitely, you know, maybe just getting to know them. Some people always, you know, kind of moan and groan at like the get to know you icebreakers, but those are a little bit fun. You can get to know somebody, you know, if you could have any superpower, what would it be? Just some of those really off-the-wall questions that'll kind of get to the heart of what someone's about. Let's see here. They say group activities or awards, potlucks. Potlucks are great for VISTAs, you know, living on that living allowance. Those are always great, potlucks. Asking them to write a reflection before weekly supervision. It's a great idea. You know, what did you, how did you think things went this week? What are you most proud of? What do you want to work on next week? Like those sorts of things. Let's see. Talking to them with respect and follow up on concerns or questions they may have. I think that's extremely important. Not only talking to them with respect and treating them as, you know, a professional, but also following up. So if they bring a concern to you, not just dropping it by the wayside, you know, following up, making sure that, once again, consistency within your organization, within your relationship with the VISTA really creates that strong foundation. And let's see here, let's end here with Buzz. Buzz said conversations about what success will look like or how it will be measured. So yeah, so, you know, I think, Elaine, you can speak more to this, but the activity, you know, like if you're successful in your VISTA project, like draw out what that would look like. That's another activity you can do with your VISTAs, like success as me as a VISTA, this is what it would look like when I'm done. You do the same thing as what you see the end result being after your VISTA leaves, and see how those match up. See if those are in sync, if they're out of whack, because that'll really help. Elaine, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Those are great. Kudos to everybody. And they may sound pretty common, but you know what? There's no magic in the answers to what are the best ways to help a person manage their mental health challenges. It's really all the things you said. Consistency, so important for everybody. Predictability, and we get that through feedback. Investment, and you all talked about that. I do want you to know at the pre-service orientation, during their VAD session, they are asked to do a drawing of what if they're highly successful in their given year, what that might look like in a sketch, a napkin sketch. And so, you know, we tell them bad art is a good thing, so just dive in. And we have them draw it out, and we do ask them to share it with you. So that's something else as supervisors that you can say is, let me see your napkin sketch. It's in their workbook, so they should have it with them. Those are great ideas. And what I'm going to give you now really is just going to build on all the things you suggested. And it's a methodology called positive inquiry. And it's a positive approach to building relationships. This approach is an important means of communicating for the VISTA supervisor because it causes us to reflect on what we need to know and what we need to share with the VISTA. It originates from an intention, and this is important. Your intention is to be open, trusting, and it originates in a belief that the VISTA has a desire to succeed in their role. And I've genuinely found that most people want to succeed. You know, 99% of people want to succeed in what they're doing. So, Jessica, would you mind reading the slide?
Of course. All right. So, positive inquiry, what is it? It addresses the person's strengths and positive potential. It deliberately seeks to discover the VISTA's unique traits, gifts, and quality. It focuses on a mutual and clear expectations and boundaries, and it focuses on empathy and building relationships.
Thank you. I'm going to share some language around positive inquiry in just a few slides, but for now, I want you to realize that it's really important that the communication is free of judgment. And so if you move to a mode of observing, it usually will keep you out of judgment. You know, when I observe something and I just look at what's happening, but I don't want to interpret it in any way, I'll stay out of judgment. And the other thing about positive inquiry, it implies a desire for a win-win transaction. So we're always coming from a place of you win and I win. The project wins, the community wins, the organization wins. You know, there's no win-lose in any of the transactions when you use positive inquiry. Empathy is the primary skill required for positive inquiry, along with a focus on the VISTA's unique strengths and potential. And because it focuses on their strengths, you want to check the VAD to be sure that it's going to incorporate some of their strengths. And if that is minimal, you know, you may want to talk to the VISTA about how they can build their strengths into some of their duties, because we all know people are far more content and successful at work when they're using their strengths. Even those with fragile coping skills, they still have strengths, and sometimes that's hard to remember because you're just overwhelmed with the problems they're presenting. But if you can tap into their strengths and utilize them in your conversation and affirm them in their VISTA role, they have a better chance to succeed. So on the next slide, here are some core components of positive inquiry, and I call your attention to the first three bullets. And we've sort of covered them. Some of you covered them already. But what these three do together is create a comfortable, safe environment for your VISTA. When you are able to follow through on listening and understanding and open-ended questions and excluding judgment, you are creating an environment where VISTA, if they're unsure about saying something, if they're reticent to be open, they're going to test it out to make sure it's consistent, and then slowly that trust is going to happen. And the confidentiality part, it's not that every single thing you do with your VISTA needs to be confidential, but for some individuals, a safe environment means some of the things that they say to you, they might want you to hold it as confidential. And so you can say to them, when you want something to be confidential, please let me know, because a lot of the people who work or are challenged by mental health issues, they have a lot of guilt, they have a lot of shame, and they have a lot of fear. And so when you create that safe environment, you're making it okay to have those, those aspects in ourselves, but still you hold the expectation that they'll be successful. The fifth bullet I kind of spoke to already around communication styles, but I just want to remind you that in both the supervisor's workbook and the pre-service orientation workbook, the styles that we deal with are the degree of directness or indirectness that an individual has, so we ask them to score themselves on that continuum. Saving face is important to me, or it's not important to me at all, and we ask them to score themselves there. And then the last one is on focus. I'm very task-focused versus I'm very relationship-oriented, and to score themselves there. And so if you look at how you scored and how they scored, you'll really be able to find a way to adapt to your style, their style. The degree that it's similar or dissimilar becomes less of an important point if you make the effort to adapt. And that's mutual, that's reciprocal. You're both adapting. So the opportunity for learning is very high when that happens. If they're totally complementary, I would just say thank you and be glad that this is going to be easy. All right, so let's look at the next slide. I wanted at this point, I said to you I would help show you some language around what positive inquiry sounds like, and so we're going to dive into that right now. To help you or your VISTA successfully manage and adjust to the challenges that come with starting their year of service, being open, being invitational, being invested, which are all the things that represent positive inquiry, is the way to welcome them. It's one thing to talk about it, and it's another thing to talk positive inquiry. I can say, yeah, I'm doing it, but it really does have a special tone. It actually does sound very warm. It sounds very inviting, and it suggests a deep intention to learn about and understand your VISTA, the person they are, not just the fact that they're a VISTA. The comments and questions on this slide and the following one offer you some examples of how the language, positive inquiry. Amy?
Thanks, Elaine. I'll just model some of these for the group. So some of the prompts might be, help me understand, and then you provide specifics. What natural strengths and talents are you bringing with you to your VISTA experience? Describe what strengths that you have that will help you cope with the unknown and unpredictable as you begin your VISTA year. Tell me what you need from me. Let's talk about our expectations of each other.
Thank you, Amy. Just want everybody to know that these prompts will be available as a handout on the VISTA campus along with the recording of this session, okay? So positive inquiry also offers a great opportunity for you, the supervisor, to role model engagement and confidence in the VISTA. As I mentioned earlier, it offers opportunities to focus on current strengths and past strengths, talents and coping strategies while being sensitive to what the VISTA needs to be more confident. So Jessica, would you mind reading the questions?
Of course. So a few questions that you can ask. So have you had any previous situations where you had to deal with a new beginning or lack of predictability that comes with that? And that can even be tailored to a specific situation. So have you ever had to deal with like a setback in your professional life? Like, how did you deal with that? Tell me how you managed those situations. And then what worked for you?
Great, thank you. Amy?
So on the next slide, we have some more questions that we can ask. What are your natural talents and strengths? How can you utilize them in your VISTA role? What could you use from your past coping strategies to help you adapt to your VISTA role and responsibilities? And describe what would help you feel confident as you begin your VISTA year.
Okay, thank you so much. As you can tell, these questions reflect historical as well as current strengths. When I talk about talents versus strengths, strengths are something we can build and acquire. Talents are what each of us as individuals are born with. And so it's natural to us. And the more they can utilize their talents, the more relaxed they're going to become. So it's important to explore what they believe their talents to be. Identifying past successes and coping with new transitions may very well allay the VISTA's current anxiety, and it helps them recognize, yeah, I've done this before, and I've done it successfully. If they look back and see, I've done it before and it's been a struggle, then okay, what part of that worked for you and what part did you struggle with, and let's see what we can do right now to support you. So, you know, you're always working with them in the way to deal with uncertainties that come with the beginning of the year. And for some of the people with mental health challenges, these uncertainties can last into the middle of the year too, because as new things come up, their anxiety will go up. So far we have looked at the definition of mental health. We've identified symptoms and patterns that might signal a need for increased supervisory support and what that support might look like. And we just completed a brief overview of a powerful methodology called positive inquiry which is simple in nature, but we have to practice using it so that it becomes a part of who we are, and it doesn't sound practiced. When we use it, we're totally invested in really learning, understanding, and listening to the other person. In this section, I'm going to share some proactive responses that might assist you in helping your VISTA better manage any prolonged symptoms that they might have associated with carrying out their VISTA role. So notice how positive inquiry threads itself even into these proactive responses. Here's an example of a proactive response format. And I want you to notice how much inquiry, observation, and sensitivity is involved in these proactive responses so that relevant information is obtained, allowing for a more accurate assessment. Seeking to understand is always an effective way to begin an inquiry process. Ask yourself, what information do I need to know before I can begin problem solving with my VISTA? We mentioned this earlier, and if you don't remember anything else, remember this question, because it will change in a positive way your relationships with everyone. You can use this in your private life also. It's also important for you to not just realize what information do you need, but what don't you know, or what don't you have the capacity to find out. So not knowing certain things may have an impact on your relationship and the conclusions that you might make about what is happening to your VISTA. Always offer non-judgmental feedback about what you're observing as soon as you detect a pattern of struggle. Do not let that pattern continue. If you can address it initially, you can really start to affirm and reinforce positive approaches. You always want to ask your VISTA if this is a new or old pattern of responding to stress. If it's a new one, what do they believe might help them cope better with their stressors? So they become part of the solution and not just owning the problem. If it's an old pattern, what have they done in the past that has helped them manage their stressors? If you identify this as an old pattern, listen carefully as your VISTA describes how they coped and whether it was truly effective. Sometimes we use old patterns that really don't work for us but are familiar, and therefore we repeat them. So you may have to gently point out, you may believe that worked in the past, but right now let's see how we can adjust or build on that response. But you may see that it's not quite sufficient to get them through, and so you're going to see if you can dialogue with them and problem solve what else can they do. Also listen for whether they have sought professional help in order to cope with their stressors. They may or may not mention whether they're on medications or supplements of any kind. But a nice question to ask if you're having this conversation, which may feel difficult actually, is there anything else you would like to share? And if you offer that question in a gentle, inquiring way and are listening without wanting to respond, your best chance of people responding to the question is pretty good. I mentioned listening a few times, and bias-free listening is the key to understanding. And so I'm going to ask each of you to just take a second. When was the last time someone truly listened to you? And how did you feel internally when you felt listened to? Just get in touch with that. I have found it makes me feel important. It makes me feel like whatever I bring into the situation matters. And sometimes it blows me away that I've gotten somebody's undivided attention. I have found listening to be the most fundamental component of interpersonal communication skills. It is not something that just happens. That's called hearing. Listening is an active process in which a conscious decision is made to listen to and understand the messages of the speaker. Listeners should remain neutral and non-judgmental, and this means trying not to take sides or form opinions, which is not always easy, especially early in the conversation. Active listening is also about patience. Pauses and short periods of silence should be accepted. Listeners should not be tempted to jump in with questions or comments every time there are a few seconds of silence. Active listening involves giving the other person time to explore their thoughts and their feelings. They should therefore be given adequate time to do that. So you need to ask yourself, how comfortable are you with silence? Because I have found people would share so much more with me if I gave them time for silence. And that's especially true if you can determine whether the person you're working with is an introvert or not, because they're processing all this stuff internally. So listen for what they self-identify as needing right now. You always want to ask that question in some form of what do you believe you need right now. Inquire what they believe would help them manage their stress better. Inquire if there is someone they know who they could talk to about their stress level. Listen for information about whether they have been or are in counseling. If yes, then I would support that. If no, would they be willing to talk to someone? So I'd like to share a case example that kind of brings all these points home. It illustrates the application of proactive responses during a crisis conversation. Last summer, a VISTA candidate was triggered in a PSO session, the pre-service orientation, when the trainer extended their arm and pointed their finger at a chart on the wall. She reacted strongly and fled the training room. She came to the registration desk panicky and very upset. The CNCS person and myself found a quiet, private place to talk with her. That was the first thing we had to do, is kind of move her to a place that did not have a lot of stimuli going on. We decided quickly that I would stay with a potential VISTA, and the CNCS person would call her organization for additional information. I purposely quieted my voice and spoke very evenly. As she cried, she kept saying that she was picked on by the trainer and she felt very abused. I gently asked her if she had ever had these kinds of feelings before, and she said yes. I asked her what she had done when this happened before, and she told me she was seeing a counselor who taught her how to calm herself using cognitive techniques. So when she told me that this had happened to her before, I knew immediately something in her was triggered, and she was overreacting to it because the limbic system of the brain was not allowing her to access her problem-solving, rational, logical part of her prefrontal lobe. And so you can learn more about this if you look up neuroscience of the brain, but I just wanted you to know that what my thought process was. But I was glad that she could calm herself and use cognitive techniques that she had been taught, and we did not know that. I asked her if she would like to call her counselor. She said yes and made the call, leaving a message because she did not pick up. I then asked her if there were other things she did to cope with upsetting situations, and she said she took medications. I asked her if she was still taking medications. When she said yes, I inquired if she had taken her medication today. She told me no because she only had one left and was saving it for the plane ride home. While we waited for a return call from her counselor, I asked her what she needed right now. She did not answer for a few minutes, and so I could tell just by body language that the silence was soothing for her, and she was comfortable with it. And thankfully, I was comfortable with it. But I could see that she was less panicky. So I felt like things were slowly, going to progress into a positive place. She turned to me and said she was taught a cognitive exercise, and she suddenly began verbalizing repetitive affirmations. Now, these repetitive affirmations didn't make complete sense to me, but they made sense to her, and I watched her calm down even more. In about 20 minutes or so, her counselor called and walked her through coping steps she needed to take, including her medication. She was advised to take half her pill and save the other half for the plane. When she got off the phone, I noted she seemed calmer, and I asked her if she felt it would be helpful to go to urgent care or the emergency room, because I was thinking maybe she could get additional medication. But instead, she became upset with that question, but I stayed calm, and I suggested that she look at the choices she has. So here, I'm about to offer her some structure. She can't stay in the place that she's at, but she can make a choice, and that many times helps a person who's feeling out of control. Basically, I said to her, you can go for medical assistance, and we will help you with that, or you can take your medication as your counselor advised, or you could go up to your hotel room and rest for a while, and we'll check on you frequently. She was adamant she would not see a doctor or go to her room because she needed to be with people. So it was really a positive thing that she could tell me what she needed, to be with people. So she did choose to take half of her medication dose, and within 30 minutes, she was engaged in much more rationally and logical conversation with us, and including myself and the CNCS person. Based on the information from her supervisor state office, in our experience with her, we suggested her first priority was to take care of herself, and perhaps being a VISTA at this time was not in her best interest. She actually agreed, which was a relief to hear, and said if the PSO was this stressful, she was not ready to handle her real placement. So she had a good amount of insight, this person, which is always helpful. These are really complex issues, and it's important to realize the first step is always to calm the agitated state. If you'll notice, I didn't ask her what happened in the training room because that was not the core issue. It was her overreaction and getting her out of her panicky state. So let's hear about some of the strategies that you may have employed if you've had a challenge similar to this, or one where you had to kind of talk a person down from anxiety or an overreaction. And so on the screen you see the question, if you have managed a crisis situation with a VISTA, what strategies worked well for you? So if you would kindly enter your ideas in the chat box, we'll just take a moment.
Thank you so much, Elaine. So yeah, so what kind of crisis maybe have you managed with a VISTA, and what worked well for you? I think the steps that you outlined, Elaine, Elaine and I have been at many a PSO before, and different crises have come up. So, you know, definitely separating from the situation, you know, finding a place that we can just focus on that is always best, as the best way to start. But I'm sure, you know, you guys, I'm sure some of you have been VISTA supervisors for a while, some of you are brand new. Maybe it's a personal crisis that you've dealt with. Maybe a friend was going through something. How did you work through that? There's no right or wrong answer. Let's see, Jeremy, he's taken the first leap here. He said he approached someone in a non-hostile, in a non-confrontational way. So that's really important, making sure that the way you come across is, as Elaine mentioned, very neutral, very even. You don't want to, you know, come off badly or aggressively. We also have people here saying that Rachel said that she allowed the VISTA to talk and express themselves for as long as they want to, and just listening, not trying to interject or cut them off. So going back to what Elaine said, that importance of silence, it can be an awkward thing. Sometimes, you know, I know for myself, silence is hard. It's a hard thing to live through, but I like to fill the silence. But if someone really needs that, maybe that's the catalyst to get them to really open up. Someone else here said utilizing community partners with expertise in mental health to talk through a plan of action. So that's great. We definitely, as we mentioned, we don't expect you to be experts. We don't expect you to be able to diagnose. We don't want you to diagnose any of this kind of stuff, but, you know, reaching out to the resources in your communities to find out, you know, someone who's dealt with this more, who's more equipped, what should I do in my capacity as a supervisor to address the situation? And I think that's great, understanding where your limits are and who's best to go to. Ashley here said that she checks her environment and makes sure that it's safe and quiet. She speaks softly and she wants to get on their level. So if they're sitting, you want to be sitting. If they stand, you will stand. You want to be equal to them, not superior. I think that's really interesting. I think, Elaine, you probably agree. That's, I've never thought of it that way, but that's, yeah, you want to meet them where they're at. Yeah, even those little subtle cues can really make all the difference.
I agree.
And we'll go through one more here. Actually, let's see, we have two good ones here at the end. So Megan here said, more of what I've encountered are members feeling overwhelmed or out of control of a situation. In those circumstances, I find that listening and affirming what they're feeling goes a long way. I also agree with finding out what their strategy is and empowering them to solve their own problems. That is, not coming in with how to fix it or any of those sorts of things. So I think that's great, yeah. So, sometimes it's not even, something that's else is, some mental health challenge, but it's just something, I just feel out of control in this situation, and really affirming that those feelings are okay, and, you can understand where they're coming from and how that can feel. I think that's really important. And then last year we have Tam, who said, VISTA member frequently exhibit high anxiety that he attempted to deal with by sleeping, and he would not show up to work or meetings. He discussed it with him and learned that he could do it if he understood the importance of attending ahead of time and discussed what was going to happen. Never really got through it well, but we did the best we could. So, those are, that's great that, you tried what you could, you tried to discuss with him, you tried to find different ways, maybe explaining to him what the importance of these meetings are, and seeing what worked and what didn't. So, Tam, I applaud your work there. So, Elaine, I'm going to turn it back on over to you.
Okay. Again, kudos, supervisors. Those are great answers to this question. In fact, if you go to the next slide, Jenny, I'm not really going to linger on it, except if you notice the picture of the brain there, particularly the hippocampus and the amygdala, those two parts of the brain are in the limbic system, the center part of our brain. And when somebody overreacts or has PTSD or has manic bipolar, those two parts of the brain don't function as they should. The hippocampus, the purpose of that part of the brain is to distinguish time. And so, like the example, which was a real life example that actually happened, when that young woman fled the room because she thought she was being picked on, that was a trigger that took her back to an earlier trauma. And she reacted to it in the moment as if it were happening again for the first time. And that's because her hippocampus had shut down. And the amygdala is the bridge, if you will, from the emotional center of the brain to the front part of the brain that allows us to access logic and reason and those good things. And if that shuts down, it's like being on a five-way crowded highway, five-lane crowded highway, and suddenly it goes to one lane, and you get all this backup. And that's exactly what happens. All these emotions back up and keep that person from accessing their rational part of the brain. And so I tell you this because this will help you maybe not to personalize any overreactions that may come your way. The VISTA that I and the CNCS person worked with, she shouted. She was yelling for a while. I mean, we really had to take her from 10 to 1 in terms of calming her down. But if you don't personalize it and you remember it's things firing off in that mammalian part of the brain, and that part has to calm down before anything can change, it makes it a whole lot easier to cope. So let's go to supervisor reflections. You know, assessing the strengths and vulnerabilities and needs has to be accompanied with your own ability to engage in self-reflection and self-awareness. And so we focused a lot on the VISTA here, and all I really want to say with this slide is how very important it is to be self-aware of your own needs, for you to realize, you know, what your capacity is to manage yourself and your own reactions before we can handle and support anybody else. So if I'm somebody who generally is calm and easygoing, that's going to be great in a situation like this. But if somebody needs a lot of energy out of me, I'm going to have to step it up. So knowing myself is critical to your success in working with anybody that you're in relationship to, whether it's your VISTA or anyone else. So if we go to the next slide, please. Here's 5 questions that I'd like you to ask yourself as you begin, or as you've already begun, actually, supervising your VISTAs. And I'll just, go through them and just have you consider them for a moment because we don't have too much time. How comfortable are you dealing with your VISTA stressors? How strong are your own boundaries? Are you easily threatened, or do you feel internally confident? Or do you fall somewhere in between? And don't judge any of your answers, just be an observer. Is your communication style around power or saving face or task versus relationships complementary to your VISTAs? If not, how are you adapting to those differences? Do you offer your VISTA consistency, predictability, and structure to help them manage their task assignments without judgment? Structure is so important. Again, not just for people with mental health challenges, but for anyone beginning a new role. And how comfortable are you working with someone who might have mental health issues? What do you need to do for yourself to become more comfortable? So the answers to those questions will help you become more self-aware, which then allows you to be more in charge of yourself, to offer yourself choices of how you want to respond. And you can read a lot on emotional intelligence, where a lot of this material comes from, and there's a wonderful book called Emotional Intelligence 2.0, which is just a little quick read. So if we go to the next slide, oh, you're there already. Self-awareness is also key to recognizing when the supervisory support you offer your VISTA is not enough to help them manage their psychological and emotional issues. So coming to this conclusion, if you do, it's not easy. It's hard to say, I don't think I can help this person to the degree they need assistance or support. And so keep the integrity of the relationship and consider these 3 recommendations. 1, disclosure by your VISTA of suicidal thoughts, a history of abuse, PTSD, and associated stressors, clinical depression, personality disorders, or anything else might be a strong indicator of a need to make a referral or to reinforce support for connecting them with previous or current healthcare professionals. As a supervisor, you'll need to realize when you can be effective in helping the VISTA address their stressors and when their challenges require the intervention of a mental health professional. When preventive and proactive responses have not been effective in your VISTA's ability to function successfully, utilize community resources to access needed support, and please allow yourself the opportunity to make those choices. Call upon your mentors and your support network. Don't feel alone in this. Talk to your own supervisor or manager. Check in with human resources. They always have personnel that can speak to this. Or you may even want to talk to VISTA state office staff, but know that you don't have to go it alone. Give yourself permission to ask for help when complex mental health issues present in your VISTA. And remember, you don't have to fix their problems or know all the answers. You do need to know what resources are available to support them through a tough time. So on the next slide, and you're ahead of me, here are a couple of resources, and these links are useful resources for both supervisors and VISTA members. And just know that these sites listed here will help make referrals to your local agencies, and most agencies will provide services on a sliding scale. And then here are a few education and training resources. Check with your local community organizations to find what training may be available locally. For example, the mental health first aid trainings are offered by local agencies across the country. So check their website to find a course near you. And for your members, consider sharing the recorded webinar, Avoiding Burnout During Service. The presentation assists members with identifying their risk for burnout by helping them recognize ongoing common stressors, particularly those related to the VISTA role and their ability to cope with them. Additional webinars for members that focus on what it's like to live and thrive as a VISTA are available on the VISTA campus. And so you'll note that in the chat that Amy's putting up. So in terms of confronting the stigma of mental health issues, we can't really end this without realizing that, unfortunately, mental illness remains a stigma in our society. And so what are some of the things we can do to minimize that? First of all, we can educate ourselves and other people, just knowing the facts and realizing that, unfortunately, there are many people, 1 in 5 for sure, who will have some kind of mental health challenge. Understanding their symptoms, understanding their challenges, dispelling any false ideas about mental health is something that we all can do. Be aware of language. We hear phrases like, oh, she's crazy, or you're so organized, you're an OCD, or he's an ADD. We start labeling people far too often in our culture. So be aware of the language used in everyday interactions so that your site remains a welcoming and safe space for everyone. And if you hear other VISTAs using that, I would approach them and ask them, to change their language. See the person, not the illness. Getting to know a person, treating them with kindness and empathy means far more than just knowing what they are going through. So those are just a few quick suggestions, but I've used all these myself, and they are effective. And one of the last things I want to say to you, of the many things I recommended, I asked you to remember to always ask the question, do I have all the information I need, and what don't I know? The other thing is, research shows the most effective and influential way to affect a person is through role modeling. It's very powerful, it inspires, it motivates, it raises the integrity of the relationship as well as the level of respect. So here are 4 areas that I would recommend you could role model. One would be creating a welcoming, trusting environment, role modeling self-care, being open and being an active listener, being very consistent in your feedback, and keep in mind the quote on the slide here, taking good care of you means the people in your life will receive the best of you rather than what's left of you. And that was Carl Bryan, who is a tennis coach. So those are the things I'd like to emphasize. And then positive inquiry, it's on the internet, but it's really simple. If you just keep in mind, you always begin with the tension of really caring about this person, inviting them in just as they are, being open, and really treating them with reciprocity in the relationship. Some next steps, I just would like you to note that from here, I urge you to really develop a strong on-site orientation training for your VISTA, whatever that means for you, but know that those with mental health issues may need 3 or 4 weeks. That doesn't mean you have to hold their hand the whole time, but you do need to give them a lot of structure. Identify what you need to learn and where to go to grow your skills. So I've been in the mental health field for years, but I still go to conferences. I still do workshops. I still read. You just can't not know enough. And with neuroscience of the brain taking over so many of our resources in terms of new information on how to deal with people who have mental health challenges, I am just a voracious reader for that particular, I can't think of it, but for the neuroscience that they've discovered that's changing how we understand people. We want to create a welcoming, trusting, safe culture is the VISTAS Enter. So whatever that means for you and your organization, we all need to feel that way. And then just be an advocate and challenge the stigma of mental health issues and people who suffer from them, because we can create an environment where they'll have to deal with it, but they don't have to suffer. So I hope that you all found this information helpful. I hope you found it meaningful in your roles as intermediary and sub-site and site supervisors and leaders and maybe even VISTAs. It was a complete honor to be able to share this with you today, and a pleasure, and I thank you.
Thank you so much, Elaine, and thank you all so much for joining us. On the right side of your screen, we're going to get to Q&A, but first we just want to have you take our quick evaluation. You're going to see a poll where you can share feedback about this webinar. Please just take a moment to answer the questions. We do like to improve these webinars. This webinar was developed because we heard from you that you wanted this topic addressed. So we read them. We love to know what you loved. We love to know what you didn't like. So please let us know what we can do and what else you'd like to hear from us. And then we'll move on now to the Q&A. That poll and that evaluation will still be up, but we're going to go ahead and start with Q&A. So we've given you a lot to think about. This is a big topic. So, and there are a few questions that have come in, but I'm sure there's even more questions that haven't yet been asked. So I'm going to ask the operator to join the phone right now and just let us know how we can answer, or sorry, ask a question verbally. Operator, are you there?
And yes, ma'am. If you would like to ask a question over the phone lines, please press *1, make sure your phone is unmuted, and record your name at the prompt. To withdraw your question, press *2. One moment, please, for incoming questions.
Thank you so much. So as we wait for questions to come in on the phone, I do know that there were some that came in, and Ray, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, asked, and this one's to you, Elaine. So the question is, the example Elaine gave was positive because the VISTA member recognized that she had a problem, but I've had VISTAs that did not recognize that there was a problem. Do you have any suggestions on how to help VISTAs become more self-aware?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ray. The process with this VISTA took about 3.5 hours. So it didn't start off positive at all. And so keeping in mind that it's the limbic system of the brain that's firing off, the first thing you need to do is just get that calm. So if you have VISTAs, any of you, who can't quite settle themselves down, I would make the only goal to get them calm, period. If it means that a meeting with them needs to take place the next day or later in the afternoon, I would postpone that part, because you're really not going to get anything effective done until they can access their prefrontal lobe and really be logical, rational, you know, and able to have some insight about what's going on with them. Also, people who don't, who have mental health problems and don't take their medications, usually they're the ones who really have no impulse control, so they tend to react or overreact very quickly. And again, to even ask the question, have you ever been to see a counselor? Have you ever been coached to be in counseling? Have you? Is there anything you're taking to help you manage these overreactions? Even to get those questions out, they have to be in a calmer state. So that's the first thing I would do. And know that if they're not on their medications, when they're in a calmer state, one of the things that you can say to them is, how do you notice your performance, or how do you believe you're doing without your medications? Because many of them will say, I'm not taking my medications. And then you can offer after they've answered what you've observed. And so if there's a difference between their self-view and yours, that's going to tell you a lot about how distortion is playing into this. And if there is a complementariness about the observation, yours and theirs, then that could offer you grounds for problem solving.
Thank you, Elaine. So while we're on the topic, this made me think of this, and this has been a question. I think this may have been a question even in the registration that came up, was around medication and around, I guess, the health care benefit that VISTA provides. So I'm not going to go into deep depth about that because health care, as we all know, can be a challenging conversation. But the VISTA program does provide a health benefit, whether that's for people who have insurance outside, through a marketplace, through a parent, through whatnot, or if they're legally exempt to have insurance, we do provide a benefit that covers, preventative care. But in that benefit, there are some mental health or, those kinds of benefits. So I think there's like a certain number of mental health visits you can get during your service term, and then if you have insurance, they should check with their insurance to see what that provides. But the health care allowance, whether they choose a health care allowance or if they can get on our health benefit plan, the prescription benefits are great. So hopefully not being able to get their medication, hopefully that's not something that would be a barrier to them to, being able to do that self-care that they need. And I would recommend that you talk to your VISTAs too. If they come up and they said, I don't have my medication, talk to them about the health care. Have they explored the different options that may be available to them? Because we definitely don't want to see that as a reason that someone can't be at their best is because their health care stuff is out of whack. So just as a side note on that. Operator, do we have any questions over the phone?
At this time, there are no questions queued up, but once again, as a reminder to all parties, if you would like to ask a question over the phone lines, please press *1 and record your name.
Fantastic, thank you. So let's take a look here. We got, so here's one. We said, Ashley here asked, how should a supervisor follow up with the difficult conversation they have had with a VISTA on mental health issues? It sometimes feels the mental health issue is center stage and not the person's own individual strengths.
That's an interesting question. If you've had an initial conversation, you really have to pay attention to where you ended that conversation. And you may want to make a couple of notes so that when you engage again, you're right. You want to take into account that there's a mental health issue influencing this person's ability to carry out their VISTA role. But you also want to have a conversation about their responsibilities as a VISTA. And so I would open it invitationally again with some inquiry around, how did you feel about our last conversation? What part of this needs, that conversation needs to be continued? I appreciated that you talked about your mental health challenges, and I'd like to talk with you about ways that we can support you to manage them so that you can be successful as a VISTA. What would that look like for you? So my point is that you're always looking to them for their solution, the solution to come from within them. And your message to them is always about inviting information and that you're ready to listen, but never assign yourself the task of making this okay, because you're going to end up feeling like this is something that is unmanageable. And while they have this mental health challenge, they also signed up for a VISTA. So the question ultimately is, how do we support you in your managing your mental health challenge so you can be a successful VISTA?
Thank you, Elaine. I do just want to be cognizant of the time. We are at our hour and a half. We are going to, as Amy, of course, Amy's always one step ahead of me. We understand if you need to disconnect. We know you're busy, but we are going to stay on here to answer the remaining questions if there are any other ones that come up. So please feel free to stay. We would love to have you here, but we also understand that you may have busy supervisor stuff to do. So one question that came up here, it's really great. This is one that I haven't heard before. So Elaine, I'm lobbing another one to you. Laura asks, The VISTA started on August 1st, but I see ways that I need to improve as the supervisor. How do I make changes even though we've already started?
Another great question. You know, it's never too late, and even when VISTAs come after they've been on site a month or two and they come to PSO, or supervisors have been on supervisors for a while before they come to the supervisor orientation, or leaders, I always say to them, you know, why don't you go back, because they're wanting to make some shifts, and say to your supervisor or to your VISTA or to your leader counterpart, you know, in this case, I went to an orientation and I started thinking about some things, and I want to shift some things in myself, and I want to have this conversation with you. In your instance, you may not have gone to an orientation, but you still have wonderful insight into wanting to make some shifts. And I would just say that to them, that, you know, you're thinking about your supervisor role, you're thinking about how you can be more effective in working with the VISTAs, more effective in helping them reach their goals, and in building the relationship that the VISTA and the supervisor has. So I would really put it with the relationship. And so I'm going to share with you what I've been thinking about, some things I'd like to change. So I'd be pretty open about it. I would own it. And I think there's nothing wrong, because you're role modeling for them that they could do a very similar thing, not with you, but with their colleagues or their partners or other VISTAs or the community they're working with. We always, and that's really healthy to be able to say, I think I can make some changes for the better. And so I just want you to know that's what I'm going to do. And you don't get into any recrimination or judgment of the way you've done things. You just kind of pat yourself on the back for your insight and your tenacity in wanting to shift.
Thank you, Elaine. So another question that we had here, and it makes me think about what things we can update in our system and what we can include, because Megan here had a great question. She had a question about, she said, in particular, one of our VISTA's father just passed away. And so she's asking, are we aware of any grieving resources available to her? So I know VISTA has some things about, emergency leave if there's a death in the family, but not any resources on our VISTA campus about how to deal with grief and how to cope with that, especially if someone as close as a father. So, Elaine, do you have any suggestions or any resources that you may recommend, or any places that maybe they could refer their VISTA to, just to kind of get that support during that hard time?
Yeah, and I appreciate that question. Grief came up in several comments in the registration. First of all, there's a wonderful book called Complicated Grief, and it talks about grief in general, but it also talks about when something has happened that complicates the ability to grieve. So first of all, it gives everybody, in terms of the reader, permission to feel their feelings, their sorrow, and sometimes we confuse that with depression, and it could over time lead to depression. But in the moment, the first thing we want to do is give them, help them feel free to experience their grief in whatever way is appropriate for them. Secondly, asking them what do they need at this time in particular. Some people are going to want quiet, and they're going to go internal. Some people are going to cry, and we'll make that okay. And it's important that the people around them are comfortable if they have tears or break down from time to time during the day. Some people are going to want to talk about it. And for those who really need to talk about it quite a bit, I would recommend, who do you know, or is there, somebody in the organization who, do you have an employee assistance program? Not that they need to get into one, but just somebody who they can go and just sort of share their sorrow with and get some support. or even in the community, if you look at the hospices, there are many times lists of grief counselors that you don't have to have been in hospice or had anyone who was in hospice that passed away to access these grief counselors. And also, there is just tremendous stuff on the internet around grief, and so to kind of inform yourself, number one, but simply stating a total open approach to, I understand this has really got to be a hard time for you. I'm not sure what you need, but I am willing to listen. If you can tell me what it is you need right now, and if it's space, that's fine. If it's a shoulder to cry on, that's fine. But again, it comes back to engaging with them to tell you what's the best thing for them. So those are some of the resources I know of, and there's always the 911 resources, but I don't want to scare anybody with 911, but the fact is you can call there if you have extraordinary grief as a result of a personal loss, and they will give you some information around who's available to talk to.
Thanks, Elaine. And someone else here a little bit ago, Alexis, she shared in the chat that a resource is called the Crisis Text Line. So you can text START to a certain number, and you can reach a crisis counselor 24/7. So that's a really great resource too. Another way to kind of get that help.
And the people who work with crises, this person may not need an ongoing conversation. They may get just what they need with that initial contact. And if not, then they'll definitely get a resource.
That's right. No, and that's correct. And, yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of different resources, aside from just 911 and the text alert. So definitely just check what's local in your area. One question that did come up related to this, Megan asked, outside of the VISTA campus webinars and healthcare, are there any outside low-income resources for VISTAs struggling with mental health that you are aware of, like, for example, counseling services? And where my mind went, which I found is a cool resource, and many of you know this, the Meetup. They have Meetup. I don't think it's more than just an app. I think it's a website. So people can create groups based on interests. You can be, all women's nonfiction book club. You can do a cycling group. But a lot of times they have meetups for people suffering from, they have an OCD meetup of Baltimore, or they have a depression meetup of, Central Oklahoma. Like, they have different ones. So that might be another way that, maybe sometimes it's just comforting to be around people who know, what it's like to go what you're going through, to not feel like maybe you have to mask what's going on, that you can kind of just be open. I don't know if that's necessarily like low income, but it's something that's kind of different than just like going to the doctor, like seeing a professional psychologist. Like, it's just a community-driven resource. Elaine, do you have any others that just kind of jump out at you at maybe places they could check out that aside from like the VISTA campus and like healthcare professionals?
The one you're talking about, is that NIHA?
NIHA?
Yeah. Is that the one you're talking about? NIHA?
No, sorry, Meetup. It's like a Meetup app. It's like a group thing, yeah. Something totally different.
I'm sorry. There's NIHA, and I wish I could remember what the acronym stands for. It's National Institute, and it has to do with all kinds of resources for people with mental health challenges. And so if you just Google that, you can go from there. The other thing is community organizations, family agencies. United Way frequently is very good at directing people to agencies that will have either no charge for a certain amount of counseling sessions, or there'll be a very minimal charge. And people frequently overlook United Way as an incredible resource in their community, but they have their hands on the pulse of almost everything having to do with nonprofit services. So those are the things I would add.
Fantastic. Thank you, Elaine. And someone else put in here, Angela, put, lots of cities have low-income clinics. So that's another way, just that community effort, seeing something that's more local might also be resources that your VISTAs can check out. And I know it's extremely difficult, too, for those who relocate to serve and who are unfamiliar with the area. But, as your VISTAs find different resources, maybe compile those. And then so if you have another VISTA the next year and something comes up, you kind of have those in your back pocket.
Yeah.
Lesha, I hope I pronounced that correctly, or Lisha, we have a VISTA who is now in her second year. She misses deadlines, arrives late, etc., even after many conversations and meetings with her. She always promises to change her behavior, but something is holding her back, but she will not share what is going on with her. Any suggestions on kind of how to draw that out or kind of get to the root of what's going on?
Well, I have more questions. This is one of those situations where I'd like to know more information, but since we can't do that at this point, she's in her second year, which means she somehow got through her first year. So one of the first things I would ask myself, has something changed in this second year, or was that a pattern she had in her first year? If it was a pattern she's had, then this is not new to her, and it's probably not even a problem for her because she got into her second year. And so, but it is for the supervisor and for the organization. So I would sit down and ask her, I would start off with, what is working well for you right now? Instead of going after the things that aren't working so well, I would build the platform of reconnecting her to her strengths. If you can observe or have observed anything that's worked well, I would note those and reinforce and affirm those for her. And then I would move to, okay, we've talked about what's working really well. I want to talk about a couple things that we've already talked about, but they're not changing. And I'm wondering, here's the invitation. I'm wondering if you can help me understand why this is continuing or why, you continue to be late. I really would like to understand that. So again, I'm going for the, I want to understand. I'm not judging you. You don't have to bring in this can't continue at this point, but your best shot really is to figure out if this is an old pattern, a new pattern. If it's new, it's more likely to change. If it's old, it's going to be a little bit harder. But with the invitation to help me understand, it starts to put the responsibility on this person. And if they give an answer to that question, then can we talk about some of the things that you think could happen that would prevent you from coming in late on a consistent basis? What could help you change that pattern? Because here's the effect it's having on the organization, on the project, on our relationship, So start broad with a firm foundation of strengths and then work into the areas that need improvement, but they've been acknowledged already, so it's not like going to be a surprise. So you just build on trying to understand why they're continuing. And, it just depends on what they're going to say. They could say many different things, but they also want to set the expectation in the third part of this is really want to work with you to be more successful in meeting your obligations. So we're holding the expectation that you will be on time. You don't step back from that. You kind of tiptoe up to it so that you don't get into a conflict or it doesn't feel like a confrontation. This one is one where I'd want to know, what don't I know about this situation or this person? And is there a way that I could approach that and get some answers?
Thank you so much, Elaine. And also, I think something that you mentioned earlier, I think to another question or during the session about bringing it back to, you know, like let's set up a time to, like, as a follow-up. So, like, here are the action steps, like, hey, we see that you're late. Like, these are the action steps, like, you're going to be on time. We're going to check in next week, see how it's going. And, like, just to continue follow-up, you know, I know it's probably not many people's preference to micromanage, but it sounds like maybe that's something as well, and then maybe that can get to the root of it as well.
Right.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say quickly, the thing is that some of the examples that were given in this situation, this is not a diagnosis, this is just an observation, feel like they're passive-aggressive. So I'm wondering, you know, the things that would cause me to think about is there an authority issue? Not that it reflects on the supervisor, does it reflect on some old issue with authority? You know, is this a procrastination thing? Is this person like the example of the person of the VISTA I gave you early on in this conversation, where they don't really follow through because they actually have such a perfectionist streak that they feel like they're going to look stupid when they can't be perfect. And if that's the case, then we need to make being imperfect, which is a normal state, okay. So just some other thoughts with that.
Thank you, Elaine. We have another question here from Ursula. She asks, we have a VISTA that has been out the past couple of weeks. We requested a letter for accommodations from the doctor, and the letter we received was very vague and asks us to be flexible. So what is VISTA's policy on reasonable accommodation with no info? So this is a great question, Ursula. You know, VISTA is a federal program. We follow, you know, federal ADA guidelines. This sounds like, you know, in the chat you also added a few other things like what is, can they work partly from home? Can they do only some of that? This sounds like a situation where you would need to talk to your state office about next steps and what this means for this person's service. They've been out a past couple of weeks, and so this is they get 10 days personal, 10 days sick, and then that can be, a state office may be able to extend a little bit of sick time for like medical, but you know, the more time that goes on, it needs to know, you know, what are the next steps? Can they continue their service, and those sorts of things. So it sounds like at this point, you know, you've done what you can. At this point, you should talk to your state office. I'm not sure if you're an intermediary, if you are a single site project, if you have like a project director you report to who then contacts the state office, but follow that chain and they'll be able to guide you in what the next steps will be. You know, definitely, you know, you want to follow all those regulations, want to follow all that, the law and all those sorts of things. But, you know, just based on the amount of time that they've already been out and kind of the next steps of what you've gotten, it's kind of time to loop in the state office. So that's my recommendation. I don't think we're going to have any questions on the phone, but let me go to the operator. Operator, do we have any questions on the phone?
At this time, we are showing no questions from the phone lines. If you would like to ask a question, please press star, then 1, and record your name when prompted.
Thank you so much. So it looks like we've answered most of the questions here. One last question that did come up earlier, and we did answer it because we have some resources on the VISTA campus, but Elaine, you are a wealth of knowledge, so I'm going to loop you into this one too for our last one. You talked about communication styles. Do you know of any other resources outside of like the VISTA campus or anything that you found really useful about communication styles and learning more about that?
Yes. You know, think of the different styles that we all have when we approach our jobs or any assignment that we have, you know, in this case, a VISTA assignment. And so there's the communication style, which, you know, different people talk about it in different ways, but I love the way VISTA talks about it because it's, you know, are you direct or indirect? If you've got a direct VISTA and you're an indirect supervisor, that's not always going to feel good, okay? So you want to adapt to that. So it's real clear what you're wrestling with. If you're, you know, somebody who needs to save face and you are with somebody who's brutally honest, that's not going to feel really good. And so I'm giving you extremes. And if you have a person who's very task-oriented but you're relationship-oriented, then that task person may feel a little raw you know, might be hard, you know, to work with them because they don't have the more soft abilities, but they have the outcome abilities, and so you want that. So it gives each person a chance to grow. But also our work styles, you know, and there's really good stuff on the internet. I just, for another conference I'm doing, I just finished looking up work styles, Bonner, B-O-N-N-E-R, and they talk about people who tend to be bottom line oriented, people who tend to be people oriented, people who tend to be more creative and idea oriented, and people who are very detail logical oriented. And I would definitely check that out because that makes a huge difference, you know, on top of the communication. If your work styles are very different, it might get in the way. And then finally, introvert versus extrovert. You know, are you knowing who you are, and I think there's ambivert now too, where you're a little bit of both. You know, that's going to help. You know, I would look at those 3 levels of how a person functions. So the communication part, the work style part, and really, if you just Google work styles, you're going to get a bunch of stuff. But the one that I really like is Bonner, B-O-N-N-E-R. And then introvert, extrovert. There's a book out on introverts right now because they're not particularly understood. They can always look like they're not invested, but yet they are deeply invested and not always willing to verbalize it, though. And extroverts have special needs, too, in that it looks like they need a lot of attention and affirmation, but what they really need is another person for them to process. And so they'll go after that in whatever way they can. So these 3 areas, if we can understand our VISTA and the VISTA can understand the supervisor, you're going to have great opportunities for growth and wonderful relationships because no matter what combination you are, you'll work with it and expand yourself.
Thank you so much, Elaine, and that's just like a perfect way to end this webinar, everybody. We thank you for joining us. We appreciate all the work that you do with your VISTAs and you support them, and we love having you on our webinars. So our next supervisor webinar is going to be VISTA member retention, which is going to be on October 18th. And then our next VISTA member webinar is going to be writing winning proposals, which will be October 26th. So we hope that that you can join us and that your VISTAs can join us, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you all so much.